Hey everybody, so this is lecture 10. A little stuffy here, so please bear with me. We're talking about policy, okay? Now, I'm going to probably talk in front of my slides here, but just so you know, what we're going to learn about in this lecture is why policy even matters, right? You might scoff and be like, who cares about policy, right? Show me the 0 days. Show me how to hack stuff, right? Policies are really important when it comes to actual effective cybersecurity for large organizations, really small organizations too, but they're less likely to have kind of formal policy and it's more tribal knowledge. We're going to talk about the whole reason of having policies, as I kind of just alluded to. I'll explain like what is good, like what goes into a policy that's actually effective, how we can make some. I'll give you some examples throughout the talk. Hopefully I won't spoiler alert too many slides as they come up, but we'll see. Okay, so here's the crux of it. This one bullet here, technology by itself cannot solve all network security problems, is the answer for policy. Now, you may be scratching your head and be like, well, I don't get it. Here's the deal. You can have the absolute coolest, most expensive, fastest, best run, slickest, cool eye candy looking security technology, which we talked about a bunch of that in the last lecture. But if people are allowed to operate kind of like recklessly in your environment, then the domain admin who can log into anything and walk right through any security control, if that individual gives up her credentials and a bad guy can get those credentials and walk right in, the system is going to allow the bad guy to access everything. The technology that you put in place will do nothing. So how do you curb that behavior, for example, of giving up your password or having bad passwords? You do it through policy. And really, policy is a subset of what we call governance, risk, and compliance, or GRC, you may hear it referred to. And basically, GRC and policies by virtue of that and procedures are entirely designed to communicate to the organization what is acceptable behavior of staff, right? I'm sure I'm probably going to have some slides up here in a minute. So these slides are talking about antivirus won't protect everything, right? Technologically secured network won't protect everything. This is basically what I just told you, right? You can have really great technology, but it's configured to work in a certain way, and it allows access of authorized people to walk through the door, right? Both technically through access control, like logging into something, and physically, right? So a lot of technology assumes that anyone that can physically touch it is authorized to physically touch it. And we'll get into that in a minute. Well, I guess we're going to get into it now, right? So a server is not secure in the room that nearly everyone has access to. This is so true. So you have data center and you have, like network server closets and this type of thing, right? So if anyone, staff or someone who randomly walks up to the building and bums a cigarette and then walks through a side door can walk up to a server and plug a USB key into it that is running some type of malware on it, they are going to bypass all of your network layer controls, right? We talk about having the big hard candy shell around your network and a soft GUI center. This is what I'm talking about. If you can bypass all the network ones, you better hope you have a host-based IDS or something running on that machine. Chances are you don't. Plug in the USB, you're popped, right? So these are the things that we need to educate staff about through policy and procedure and then awareness training to educate the staff on it. So if you see someone walking around without a badge on, ask them where they are. I know it's uncomfortable, but ask them where they are. Ask them if they need a hand getting to where they're going. Show them to where they're going. Question them. How about locks, physical locks on the data center door? If you have a data center or a server room that's in a hallway or in a closet in a hallway, that's not good. Let's change that, okay? So as I mentioned, security is how an organization deals with something. Let me give you a nice, easy example that I love using. So your home, wherever you live right now, maybe you have an apartment, maybe you have a house, maybe you live alone, maybe you have a roommate, maybe you have a family. Whatever the rules are of your house, that is the policy set by the people who live there, or the people in charge, people who pay for living there, whatever. And the governance is putting in effect that those rules are real and have consequences if you break it. Okay, so let's continue that explanation. My kids have a bedtime of 8 o'clock at night during the school year. If they do not go to bed at 8 o'clock at night or get ready for bed or whatever you want to say it, then they lose like their iPad the next day for a couple hours, right? There are consequences to it, but these are the rules, right? Like in my neighborhood, you could technically mow your lawn at 2 a.m. in the morning, but it's kind of like socially unacceptable to do that. And if you did it, maybe you could get away with it. Then people might complain to the HOA, and then you could get penalized or something like that. But again, the whole point is that there is a set of behaviors that are put in place, and policy is a way to formally galvanize that this is standard expected behavior, right? And with a business, instead of rules for your house, it's policy for the business, which is important because usually with businesses, you have a lot of people moving around. Like I said, smaller businesses won't have written policies, but whoever owns that business or whoever runs that business will typically set the tone. We work at 8 a.m. You keep showing up at 10, that's not going to work. You're fired, right? So you'd have to formally make that a policy in a larger organization so you could then enforce it, but you get the point, okay? So let's talk about some user policies. User policies, for the most part, are defined as policies, as you would imagine, that are designed to kind of address the behavior of the end users in the community. In the cybersecurity world, end users are a huge part. That's why we spend so much time educating them on good behavior, what to look out for, best practices, etc. So, but we have policies, for example, passwords, right? We can technically configure systems to not allow 4-character passwords, right? Or just lowercase letters. We can configure that at a technical layer. What we can't do is we can't ensure that the password that the user is using for their work account, your Citadel account, we can't make sure that it's not the same password that they're using for their LinkedIn account, for their Capital One account, for their Facebook account, right? So we have to set policy that says you will not do this, and then educate to that policy. Because if those passwords get breached in a data breach of LinkedIn, and someone uses it to log into our systems, well, now we've got a problem. And it's because our end user didn't follow our policy. Now, that's a tougher one to enforce, but it's important to document it. That way you can educate to it and then ultimately handle it as the situation comes up. Plus, maybe you get a situation where an end user is complaining that they don't want to use multi-factor authentication, whatever. And you say, hey, it's policy. I know you want to use this third-party solution, right? You want to integrate it. You want to bring it in. It's going to help us be innovative here. They don't support multi-factor authentication, so no, it goes against policy. Go find a different solution, okay? There's a couple other examples here. Internet use, email attachments. You guys can read it. I mean, basically, we're getting into behavior type stuff, right? Internet use. Don't go to porn sites. Don't download malware from like weird, sketchy sites. Email attachments. We strip email attachments technically at the border, so from an end user policy perspective, know that you cannot send or receive email attachments, and there's a reason for it. Installing and uninstalling software, right? Which ultimately results in downloading malware. Sometimes you got to make these policies because effectively policy has two purposes. One, it's to communicate the anticipated expected behaviors of staff according to leadership. And two, it's to prevent and have basically a hammer when staff wants to do something that violates policy. So you get an email and say, hey, I want to install this sweet piece of open source software. It's going to help me do my job. Actually, I'll give you a real example. So I've had a situation where customer or end user client wanted to install a piece of software that basically managed their Outlook calendar, because they had multiple calendars across different businesses, right? Because they were a practicing physician, they had their own private practice, they did pharmaceutical consultations, and they wanted one super calendar to tie them all together. Okay, no, because this solution required us to give the vendor an exchange admin level account, which would mean that that account in ownership and control of the vendor, who we don't know, would have access to every email account across 20,000 users, right? So no, absolutely not. But in order to enforce that decision, despite the fact that we said it's a terrible idea, we could look at policy and say, it's against policy. We can't do it. And the reason we have the policy is to protect the organization. So thank you. Please find a different solution. Okay. There's a couple other ones here. I won't belabor it anymore. Now, system admin policies. This is more around procedures of how IT handles user accounts and stuff like that. So you really got to think. New employees, that's an easy one. What do new employees get? They get access. What do they get access to? When do they get access? Do they have to do anything? Do they have to complete onboarding training and this type of thing in order to get access? I will say typically new employees policies are easily enforced, and like the new employee wants to make a big splash at the new job. They want to do what's needed. They're complaining if they don't have access. So typically whatever you put in the policy, new employees will follow, which is good. Departing employees, as you can imagine, someone leaves, they're not complaining that they still have access. But the problem is that if it's a cloud-based solution, they leave the company to go work for another competitor and they still have access to their existing resources, they may pull it down to help their new employer, right? So system admin policies are more about being thorough and complete with whatever the process is, disabling their access, terminating all their sessions, collecting their laptop and badge, these type of things, right? Change control, if you've ever had a production outage, which means like something happens in your production environment that brings everything to a crashing halt, that's why you have change control. It's an ability to communicate with the entire enterprise or stakeholders in the enterprise of something that's going to happen, that's going to affect production, when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, who to communicate with if something breaks, and then, to execute the change. Now, change control can be pretty boring, but when something bad happens and you have the ability to quickly respond to it, it's a huge value add. But the thing is, it seems silly when you're going through change control because you're just telling people what you're doing already and documenting it, which seems like an overhead burden. But in reality, as you get used to it and you follow the policy, you'll find that it's actually a benefit in a maturing process type thing. And finally, access control. We are moving to a zero trust model, which means that you always have to verify you always have to verify the identity of the person accessing resources, regardless if they're internal or external. I encourage you to Google zero trust architecture if you want. It's definitely the way of the future, especially with cloud. But policies are basically defining what's okay to access, what level of access, how often they can access, etc. Remote access from vendors. Hopefully it's resonating with you that policy isn't just some flippant one-page document that you write up, pencil whip it, publish it, and then never think about it again. Now, some other issues worth bringing up, and this is really common, especially in this remote world that we're now living in, is BYOD, or bring your own device, right? So many of us have phones. Sometimes you're allowed to use your phone for company work. Sometimes your company gives you a phone. So there's a bunch of different forms. There's BYOD, which is like you just bringing your own device and doing company work on it. There's CYOD, which is basically like BYOD, except you have to do certain things for your device, like enroll it in a MDM or mobile device management program, or you can't access system resources unless you put a pin on your phone, right? And then there's COP, which is basically just the company provides you equipment. And at that point, it's like getting issued a laptop or anything else. They have complete control over it. And most times they'll allow you to use it for personal use, like personal phone calls or, checking the menu at a restaurant or something like that. But by and large, if they want to wipe the machine, if they want to take it away from you, it's their machine. They can do whatever they want. These further slides are just going to kind of drill into what I just talked about. There we go. Change management. All right, so I talked a little bit about this a minute ago, but just to drill into how change management actually works, right? So you can have a policy that talks about change control, but really here's what the policy is going to drill into. RFC is request for change. So who wants to make a change and what kind of change do they want? What's the impact to the production environment? What's the rollback plan if it goes sideways? How have you tested it and verified? What is the, like, what systems or applications or user group or department, what business site, like what is being impacted by this change? Document it all. Submit it, right? So that's the RFC. The RFC goes to a CAB, which is the change approval board, which is usually made up of stakeholders across appropriate segments, right? So you might have an infrastructure person there, networking, application, me, cybersecurity, right? You could have someone from the business, right, to understand what's going on, maybe someone from help desk in case, so they're aware of when these changes happen, so if they're getting calls. And they talk about what the change is, and then the CAB officially approves it or they reject it. And if it's rejected, you know, the person who made the request has to go back and make some changes. Sometimes they'll push it because they need more information, but oftentimes it's either rejected or approved. And then once it's approved, the change is authorized to make a change, right? And once it's done, then there's a follow-up on, was there any lessons learned? Can we close this change? Thank you very much, right? So that's change management in a nutshell. With software development policies, now a lot of organizations don't have this particular policy because a lot of organizations aren't developing in-house software. And it doesn't mean that you're like Microsoft and you're developing software solutions. Sometimes organizations have like data analytics people that are making like, you know, custom machine learning algorithms and stuff like that, right? But whatever it is, sometimes you're building an in-house program just to help you solve problems, whatever. But the problem with software development is, and you would probably only know this if you lived it, every time you develop some in-house solution that is super cheap because we already were paying Lisa to build it for us, thanks Lisa. But here's the problem. Lisa leaves and gets another job. No one understands what this code does, but it's become some critical business process, right? So, or it breaks and someone needs to fix it and they start bolting stuff on. So homegrown solutions are always kind of a bad idea, but if you're going to allow it, you should have some policies around it, like security standards, right? Like we're going to use this type of authentication mechanism, regardless of whatever anyone in this business develops. We're going to use this authentication mechanism, or we're only going to use this encryption algorithm, right? We talked about encryption in lecture 8. These are why standards are important. I have seen so many times, like literally, so many people roll their own encryption standard or their own cryptography, and they think it's so unbreakable, and it's not. It's ridiculous. So having standards is important in that way because if someone's producing software that's out of compliance, then you know you can not approve it, right? And then obviously testing. You should be testing anything that you're going to put into your production environment, whether you developed it in-house or you're just toggling something, or you got a vendor who's going to drop an appliance in your environment. You should test, because production downtime costs money, and the business does not want to lose money. Trust me. IR policies, right? So what is the policy? When something goes sideways, what do? You don't just freak out and run around with your hands on your head. You don't unplug everything, right? What do? It depends on the situation. Not only does it depend on what you do to address the incident, but who do you communicate with that there's an incident? What's the frequency? When do you bring legal in? When do you bring a cyber insurance provider in? How bad does it have to be? Who is authorized to unplug the data center from the internet? These are big decisions that really need to be thought through and approved from a governance perspective before you're actually dealing with a situation. Because believe me, if you just like flip out and unplug the internet and it was just a, you know, whatever, like a crypto miner in a browser or something, you're probably going to get fired or at least reprimanded once. So having policies, and really with IR, it's policies and procedures on how you're going to handle different common situations is absolutely critical, especially because timing is really of the essence when you're dealing with an active incident. Now, data classification is another policy. This one's a little bit more mature, difficult to kind of enforce, honestly. But with data classification, what we're talking about here is any data that gets created. I write a report on an incident that we had. That's a pretty sensitive thing. We don't want people to know what happened or where the controls failed or whatever. So maybe I mark that secure and it's only allowed to be used in certain areas or communicate to certain individuals or not allowed out of the organization, or it's got to be encrypted at all times versus like say public where it's like marketing material or it's our, we're a public company and it's our financials, right? For SEC compliance. So data classification is basically actually identifying and classifying what data gets what classification, and more importantly, how is each classification properly secured? What are the expectations with that? To flip this on its head, another really interesting thing about this is if we say that like secure documentation, for example, or data, needs to be encrypted at all times. Well, guess what? Now the business needs to buy me a solution that can encrypt data as I need it, right? So you can't make policy that the organization can't support, or else it's dumb. I mean, at that point, you're just violating policy for the sake of writing policy that you couldn't enforce anyway. So there is implications into like what is the financial obligation and the procedural obligation of the organization when they're setting policy. Again, this is why you can't just download policy templates and change the name from default to your business name, publish them, and be like on your way. Like it has to actually work for your organization, which is something a lot of organizations don't fully understand, which is why they struggle to mature. Now, business continuity and disaster recovery. Just really quick about these things. These are plans: business continuity plan, disaster recovery plan. Think of disaster recovery plan as one version or one reality of a business continuity plan, right? So business continuity is like when things are kind of breaking down or you're dealing with an incident, what are the core things that make the business money or are required as critical mission functions that you need to keep up, right? Or if everything goes down, what's the first thing you got to bring back up? Is it email? Is it the, printing press? Is it, the website? I don't know. Again, that's got to be a business decision, but that's what business continuity is. So you could still have like half your facility down, right? Like you're not actually producing, like let's say you produce clothes. You're not actually producing clothes anymore because your actual manufacturing arm is still down, but you brought the website up so you can still sell inventory that you've already produced, right? So the business is still making money. Now, disaster recovery means like something that has gone really bad, right? Hurricane comes through and wipes out your manufacturing site. So you're not trying to put it back up. You've got a disaster on your hands. So do you have a second facility that's up and running? Do you co-locate with like maybe you got an arrangement with like 5 other manufacturing businesses and you all pay 1/5 of the lease on this facility that's like ready to go. And if any of you ever experience a catastrophe, you get to spin up that manufacturing site and start producing t-shirts or whatever until you can get your main site back up, right? So that's what disaster recovery is. Oftentimes, hopefully, you don't really deal with disaster recovery, but you can think of black swan events like 9/11 as a DR event. Recently in France, there was like a massive fire that burned down a huge data center. Like think of like an Amazon AWS data center going down, which brought a bunch of businesses to a grinding halt. So it's kind of hard. Business continuity is a little bit easier. Disaster recovery, you really have to think of these like extreme situations and then figure out a solution that makes sense, right? Most businesses can't afford to have a second facility up and waiting to be occupied, especially when these events happen infrequently. So you've got to come up with some solution that works with your financials and with your risk appetite. Okay, I missed one. BIA is business impact assessment. or business impact analysis. I mean, this is basically where you discover what your critical business processes are to drive the priority in the business continuity plan. It's an exercise we're not going to do. It's a much more I don't want to call it advanced, but like you would only do it if you were a risk analyst. Okay, so fault tolerance, right? So backups are pretty important, especially in the world of ransomware. There's different ways to do backups. You can do like backup. Let's think of your computer for a second, right? Back up the whole computer. Okay, so maybe that takes like 5 hours, right? Differential, all changes since the last backup. So you back up your computer, and then tomorrow you back it up with a differential, and it literally just backs up every change between when you backed up yesterday and today, right? So maybe it wasn't that big, which means it's going to take you 1 hour, right? Incremental is, well, I guess the best way to understand incremental is with differential. If we took another backup tomorrow, then it would still back up of the 2 days. And we took one the third day from now, it would back up to 3 days because it's always since the last full backup. So essentially you have a full backup and you have a differential and you only have 2. Incremental is what it sounds like, right? You have the full backup, then you have day 1, then you have day 2, then you have day 3. And the whole benefit is that those backups are smaller, right? And they take less time to take, but your trade-off is in restoration. So if you did a full backup every day, which would be incredibly expensive from a time and resource perspective, if you had a problem, all you'd have to do is restore one backup. With the differential or the incremental, you'd have to restore the one backup, then you'd have to restore the first incremental, the second incremental, the third incremental, the fourth, right? So it takes time. So that is the trade-off. The trade-off is having it faster at the front end or faster on the back end. RAID is I forget what that acronym stands for, but basically it's the idea that you can have multiple hard drives that are kind of mirrored with each other. And that way, if a hard drive fails, which physically happens, right? Like let's say this hard drive fails, you pull this one out, this one keeps going because it's a duplicate, exact duplicate, and it's writing. Then you slide in a fresh hard drive, and this one will mirror, it'll catch up, and then eventually they'll be mirrored again. And that's how that works. So if you've ever had a hard drive fail, like a thumb drive or something, and you lost something, RAID is the solution to solving that problem, so you never have a complete failure of your data. Now, policy is often developed in-house, but there are external factors that influence policy. We list a couple here for laws and regulations. HIPAA is in the healthcare space, and HIPAA dictates certain rules that you will have enforced in your environment, and typically it's basically a flow down where you would write policy to implement those rules, right? So maybe you have what's a good HIPAA policy, right? Like remote access will require, or any access to PHI, any access to personal health information will require auditing of who accessed it, right? That's a HIPAA law. Well, guess what? When you're writing your audit policy, you will definitely include that because HIPAA requires it. Same with Sarbanes-Oxley. That has to do with publicly traded companies, but the way that IT is audited and configured, SOX does that. And PCI's, payment card industry. Basically, the point of this slide is to just understand that policy can be externally influenced, and it happens all the time. So I know this was a bit of a quick lecture, which I'm sure many of you appreciate. But basically what I want you to take away is that there's all sorts of policy, and a lot of people kind of pay it little mind, but you need to understand that the whole point of policy is for the organization as kind of a living entity to explain to the staff what leadership's expectations and rules are for working and operating within that, business ecosystem. And as we get more adopted to cloud, as we adopt more remote workforce stuff, there is so much technology, so much cloud-based systems, so much data. Your home network is now involved, which, I don't put controls on that. We got BYOD with your phones and stuff like that. So there's a lot of intermixing of different technologies and different access points and stuff like that. So policy becomes even more important to really appreciate and understand what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. And I'm not even talking about like, oh, I'm going to get fired because I did such and such. It's more about like not introducing undue risk to the organization, because if the organization gets popped and it goes out of business, everybody's out of a job, including you, right? And I know this is a little bit of an extreme example, but my point is policy isn't just for the man to be dictating down to you how you're going to operate. It's really there to ensure the stability and resiliency of the entire organization. Okay, so I hope you had a good time with this one. I know it was quick. Policy, it does get a bum rap, but it is important. All right, thanks so much. We'll see you in the next one.